الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Today inshallah we'll begin a new series on the history of the compilation of the Ahadith and its authenticity. And what we hope to do inshallah in this series, similar to what we did before about the Quran, is to number one, defend the Ahadith literature, the Hadith that we all take for granted, the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and also understand better how ulum al-Hadith, the sciences of Hadith, work in terms of its development and also authentication. And you find, brothers and sisters, many people, they're not very well versed in this topic, largely because we don't have any doubt. We know that Sunnah of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam is preserved. But the question comes for younger people who maybe ask that question. How do you know Bukhari, for example, Al-Bukhari or Muslim is Sahih? How do you know they're authentic? Or what are the mechanisms that are used to authenticate the Hadith? Or the questions like, how do we know that our ulama are trustworthy in comparison, in face of the criticism of the Orientalists? So for those reasons, inshallah ta'ala, we hope to cover in this series those kinds of topics, and we'll talk about which major topics we'll cover. It's only befitting we start with the hadith itself. And Abdul ibn Abbas radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم تسمعون ويسمع منكم ويسمع ممن سمع منكم. Hadith Sahih for Abi Dawood. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said from the hadith of Abdullah ibn Abbas that verily you will hear from me and others will hear from you, and people will hear from those who heard from you. And this is one of the many ahadith about ulum al-hadith. The Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam reminding us that we have in our ummah asanid, change of transmission, and that it is going to be transmitted this way. So it's important to be mindful of these kinds of ahadith. تسمعون ويسمع منكم ويسمع ممن سمع منكم. Today's lesson, inshallah, we'll begin with the first part, which is to do with the history of hadith compilation. And just the beginning of it, and we'll go a little bit every week. The main goals we hope to cover is how hadith was compiled, who are the early compilers and the narrators, the isnad system, hadith criticisms, and the methods of authentication. So this is important. How is hadith, tasheeh wa tad'eef al-hadith, how does it work? Doubts then about from the hadith rejectors and responses to them. So those who claim themselves the Qur'aniyun, right? Those who claim to be the Qur'aniyun, we're going to respond to them and their doubts. And lastly, the Orientalists, the Western academics who study hadith and they have proposed or raised certain questions and doubts. For references in this series, there are a number of books you can refer to. Too many to mention all of them, but I'll just mention three very important sources. Anyone can find them, some in English and some in Arabic. And these are good sources to go and check about hadith literature and the history of it. The first one is a book called Tadween al-Sunnah al-Nabawiyya. This is a book written by a contemporary scholar from the scholars of Islamic University of Medina. Zahrani, his name is. And so this book is mainly about the summary of the topic, Tadween al-Sunnah al-Nabawiyya. How was it written? Nash'atuhu, watawuruhu, its beginnings, its evolutions, etc. So you can find this in PDF. It's in, I think, in Islamic University of Medina Hadith, Kulliyat al-Hadith, the College of Hadith. They study this book and they go over it. So one of the Dakatila, he wrote this, doctors there. So that's a good one, Tadween al-Sunnah al-Nabawiyya. The second one, which I will use a lot, studies in early Hadith literature. Dirasat fi al-Hadith al-Nabawiyya. So this book is written by Mustafa Azami, rahimahullah. And this is probably one of the most important books. It's in English. It's originally Arabic, translated into English. And Mustafa Azami, we mentioned his name before, he's one who wrote about the Quran. So this book is his defense of the Hadith against the Orientalists, and he wrote it as a PhD or a master's, and he presented it, I think it's a master's, he presented it to the Orientalists, and they accepted it. So it has a very important book, because not only what he proves in that book, the fact that the Orientalists, like his mushrif, his supervisor, one of the bigger Orientalists, affirmed the book and its authenticity and its academic nature. So it's important because later if we will come and we argue what he argues, someone can't come and say, oh, you guys are just, blind following your ulama. It's like your ulama also agree, right? So this book is good. Studies in Early Hadith Literature, Mustafa Azami. And the last one is a scholar many of us are familiar with, the great Imam of our time, Shaykh Allama Abdul Al-Muallimi Al-Yamani, Anwar Al-Kashifa. And this book is a very, very good book, if not the origin of all these topics, especially on the doubts issue. Anwar Al-Kashifa is a response by Shaykh Allama Al-Muallimi, rahimahullah, towards some of the doubts raised by a particular critic in the Arab world. And we'll see later who this guy is and what he raised of questions, specifically in defense of Abu Hurairah radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. And those who don't know, Al-Muallimi is the Dhahabi of the Asr. He's nicknamed the Imam Dhahabi of our time. So he's absolutely one of the most knowledgeable scholars of our time. But when you read that book, he does a beautiful job explaining how hadith works, why Abu Hurairah is a trustworthy narrator, any questions about jarh wa ta'deel, right? Authenticating or praising and criticizing narrators, all those kinds of questions. So these are 3 books. We'll refer to them as we go along, and you can find them as well online. To begin, we're talking about hadith. So we have to define hadiths. What's a hadith? Linguistically, hadith means speech. So when we use the term hadith, it's kalam, hadith is literally speech. And the ulama say it's called hadith because it's something which renews itself. So it goes from old to new, right? Literally from non-existence to existence. So because it keeps renewing itself, you speak and you speak again and you say something else again. Hadith was called hadith, speech was called speech because it continues to renew. Because hadith literally means something which can be new. But we're not talking about the linguistic meaning here. We're talking about the technical meaning. Hadith Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So what is a hadith? The many definitions have been given. We're just going to use one of them. And that is ما أضيف إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. That which has been ascribed to Prophet Muhammad صلى الله عليه وسلم. من قول, from speech, أو فعل, or actions, أو تقرير, or approvals, أو وصف, or prescriptions, خلقي أو خلقي. So that which has been ascribed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam of speech, actions, approvals, and description, whether it describes his physical form, khalqi, or khuluqi, his character and his manners. So this is the definition many of the ulama they use, and sometimes you find different definitions, but this is the most comprehensive because it includes everything that comes from him alayhi salatu wasalam. And the key word is the beginning, what is attributed to him or ascribed to him. So it can be authentic, it can be weak. We don't negate that, but when we say it's a hadith, it has to go all the way up to him alayhi salatu wasalam. Either what he said, or what he did, or what he looked like, or how did he behave, or what did he approve, he saw and he didn't say anything about it. So this is what we're going to use as the word hadith or a hadith. Now if you understand this, the first point that every Muslim has to believe, and it's what we're trying to prove, the thesis of this presentation, this series, is that the hadith are preserved. This is what we believe, and this is what we're going to prove. That the hadith of Rasulullah are preserved. And how do we know that? What proofs can we use to show this? We'll use the same ayah that we use for the Quran. Surah Hijr, ayah 9, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. Allah says, verily we are the ones who revealed it. The dhikr, revealed this dhikr. And we're going to look at this word dhikr, which means remembrance. وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. And it's verily upon us, so we are the ones who will preserve it. So here, most of the scholars of tafsir agree, mufassirin, they say dhikr is Quran. But can we rule out the hadith here? That's the question. Can we say this includes the hadith? And the answer is yes. إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ. Dhikra here, it can include Quran wal hadith. And so the first to mention this from those different scholars, one of the quotes is Ibn Hazm. Ibn Hazm, he mentions, rahimahullah, under the benefit in Al-Ihkam fi Usul Al-Ahkam, which is his book in Usul Al-Fiqh. He says, وَالذِّكْرُ, the word dhikr mentioned in the Quran, ismun waqi'un. It's a term that's used in relation to على كل ما أنزل الله على نبيه, for everything the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was receiving a revelation, من قرآن أو سنة. So the benefit we take dhikr الذكر here is a general word. So he says, اسم واقع على كل ما أنزل الله على نبيه من قرآن أو سنة. Everything that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam received a revelation, be it the Quran or the Sunnah. Al-Ihkam fi Usul Al-Ahkam, volume 1, page 115. And someone will say, how did he get there? How did he go from this point? Or where did he learn this? And this is by the fact that dhikr is what the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam received. And we know Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam received the Quran was Sunnah. So if both of them are wahi, then both of them are going to be preserved because Allah gave him both. Ibn al-Qayyim, he writes, rahimahullah, in Mukhtasar Sawa'iq al-Mursalah, volume 2, page 371, فعلم أن كلام رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في الدين كله وحي من عند الله. كله وحي من عند الله. We know that the speech of the Messenger صلى الله عليه وسلم, all of it, in relation to religion, all of it is revelation from Allah. وكل وحي من عند الله فهو ذكر أنزله الله. And everything that the Messenger صلى الله عليه وسلم received, a revelation, can be called and is called a dhikr, a remembrance, which Allah revealed to him. As Allah says, وَأَنزَلَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ. Allah revealed to you the Quran, the Kitab wal-Hikmah. And the Hikmah means the Sunnah. So here we learn that Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if he received, Allah says, وَأَنزَلَ. Pay attention to the Quran, you, when they say, where is it? وَأَنزَلَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْكَ كِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ. What's the Hikmah, we tell them? They're going to say it's the Quran? We tell them, Allah says, wow, and the Hikmah. So now, if he's given the Quran with the Hikmah, that means Allah revealed to him. And is there a difference between the Quran and Sunnah in terms of its status and revelation? No. He said, إِنِّي أُوتِيتُ الْكِتَابَ or Qur'ana وَمِثْلَهُ مَعَهُ. Verily, they've been given the Quran and that which is similar to it. And to the end of the Imam Ibn Qayyim's quote. So here he shows then, if the Prophet ﷺ received it, it's revelation. If it's revelation, it's dhikr. If it's dhikr, Allah will preserve it. Everybody's with me? So this ayah then shows Allah will preserve whatever is dhikr. And dhikr then is Quran was Sunnah. Hence, the Quran and Sunnah both are preserved, and we have it today in front of us. And if you look at the mechanisms of preservation, it's the same. We said the Quran is preserved through hifz, right, memorization, with kitab and writing. And so same with the Sunnah. We're going to see hifz and the kitab, the writing and the memorization. Today's large focus will be on the history of the writing, but we do know that the hifz was part of it. And people who claimed that the Quran was being written, but the hadith didn't until later, we're going to deal with this kind of claim. So it's very important to go back to this, inshallah, as we go through this series to remind us of what we're trying to establish. The next point now, or heading, is the history of the hadith compilation. The scholars of history and hadith, they mention that the hadith has been compiled and can be divided across the eras. So we have, for example, 1st century, which is the time Rasulullah was alive and the Sahaba. So this period he's alive is called 1st century. And 1st century for us, because Muslims, this is the beginning, this is the time of wahi. So the hadith has been compiled and written in the 1st century, so the Sahaba's time, in front of Rasulullah or in his time. Then 2nd century, time of Tabi'un. And 3rd century, Atba'u Tabi'un. And you can see, if you go in any history book in Islam, that they talk about the levels and times of recording. So 1st century, time of Rasulullah. 2nd century, time of Tabi'un, the successors. And 3rd, Atba'. So we know, for example, Imam al-Bukhari, which generation is he going to fall into? Is he coming here? He's going to come at the end of the 3rd, right? Towards the 4th. He's coming at the end, tail end. Hence why so many people, they thought that Imam al-Bukhari is the first to compile the hadith. Because his hadith is the most authentic. And this is the problem. No one ever said, or the hadith that Bukhari collected is the first hadith compilation. It's a mistake. We're saying that Bukhari's book is the most authentic, different story. So we're going to see today, 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, all these time periods, hadith have been recorded. So the ulama have been saying and proving that the hadith have been written down at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu was Sahaba, 1st century. The problem though, and this is the point where we have to start thinking, many Islamic scholars, and then later the Orientalists, because they always just take from us. So it's a rule of thumb. The Orientalist, anything he says, he's taken from Islam. So he can't use the tradition against us. He borrows and he weaponizes. So we always have to remember that. He tells you, always mention your books. Yeah? And we also explain it this way. How come you left the interpretation? So it's very important. So we'll see that they found the ulama saying something, so they took it. What were they saying, some of the ulama? They claimed that the hadith was first written 100 years after the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Many ulama said this. I'm going to show you some of the examples. So they argue that at the time of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Sahaba, it was only hifz, memorization. Recording happened in the beginning of the 100th year, right? Time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, Amir al-Mu'mineen. And if you look at many books of hadith, you find this discussion. For example, Ibn Hajar, Hafid ibn Hajar in Fath al-Bari, Hadi al-Sari in his Muqaddimah, he mentions this point. Go to any book, Imam Zahabi, for example, Tafsir al-Mufassirin, or any other book, you find these scholars, they mention something similar. And it became so widespread, you even find some of the latter scholars. Sadiq Hassan Khan, Abjad al-Ulum, he mentioned the same point. So some of the biggest names claim that the hadith was written 100 years. So guys, if we think about it, Imam Zahabi, Imam Ibn Hajar, Abu Talib al-Makki, many names, al-Maqrizi, they all said the same thing. And these are not small ulama, these are our historians. So therefore, it became widely known that, or thought, that the Quran was recorded in the first century. Quran was memorized in the first century. Hadith, memorized first century, recorded second, third century. And this is wrong. I'm going to say right now it's wrong. And it's not the most correct opinion. It wasn't until Imam al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, who died 463 Hijri, he was the first one to show through evidence and actual investigation that this claim is wrong. So who's the Imam Khatib al-Baghdadi? He died 463 Hijri. The Imam al-Hafiz of the East, he died the same year as who? Hafiz ibn Abdul Barr, the Hafiz of the West. They died the same year, right? The two Hufaz. So Hafiz Khatib al-Baghdadi, he's a great Imam Hadith. He wrote a book called Taqyid al-Ilm, Recording of Knowledge. And he addressed this doubt that this issue, that the Hadith was written after 100 years, is wrong by evidence and asanid, and he showed that it was written before. And what's the benefit behind this? Even though he proved this, the ulama continued to mention this point, not because they didn't recognize earlier Hadith books. It's just that they thought it was a harmless statement or not a problematic statement. Because no one negated that the hadith was being written or memorized by Sahaba. So what were they saying? They were saying that the idea of recording, the idea of compilations came later. But Mustafa al-Azami, Dr. Mustafa al-Azami, rahimahullah, he responds to this by highlighting there are four main reasons why people believe this point. And one of the reasons was the words Tadween, Tasnif, and Kitaba. Three words that have similar meanings but different applications. Tadween is usually meant to record something. So Tadween al-Hadith. Tasnif, authorship, compilation, or actually an actual book. And Kitaba, recording. These three words were misunderstood by some of the ulama. And Orientalists for sure, because they wanted to prove this point. They want to weaken our tradition. So they mixed up the words, thinking they all mean the same thing. But they don't. So Mustafa al-Azami, he found out, rahimahullah, that these three words have three different meanings, based on what the Sahaba and the earlier scholars used it. And we'll see how. The second reason why people believe this, every time you get a hadith, you get a isnad, right? And how is the hadith? Right? Those who might not know, hadith compiled two parts, isnad wal matan. Isnad is the chain of transmission, isnad, and matan is the text. So whenever you get an isnad, you get haddathana, wa akhbarana, wa an. Somebody's narrating. So they thought, some of the scholars, that, and especially Orientalists, every time you have haddathana wa akhbarana, it's a transmission by riwayah. It's not kitabah. So anytime you get a book, it always says, even if it's a book, qala shaykh so-and-so haddathana. So they say, it must have been recorded verbally. It was orally transmitted. The guy who wrote the hadith down, he's the first guy to write it. And this is a mistake, because some of the ulama, even though they wrote down the hadith from the teacher, they wrote it down with haddathana wa akhbarana. Because that's how they heard it and that's how they wrote it. So we're going to see that later, that doubt. We won't focus on it today. Thirdly, they claimed, and it's true, that the Arab have very strong memories, especially at that time. Hence, they didn't need to write down anything. They just had to memorize it. And this is true. Most of the Sahaba used to memorize, they never used to write. But fourthly, a hadith, and there are some ahadith against recording a hadith. And this is what the Orientalists like to use. They try to use the hadith against the hadith. It's paradoxical, right? Where did you get the hadith? He's going to say, well, there's a hadith. from the Sahaba who narrated the hadith, right? So we're going to see that this is one of the arguments. And this is in his book, Studies in Early Hadith Literature, page 20. So when you look at what Mustafa Azim is doing, he's trying to find out why would anyone say this, and how even the great Imam, the great Imams, they didn't know this point. Today we'll just focus on two of them because of the time. The first one is the word tadween. It's very important. Anyone who you talk to who's educated about this topic will tell you, brother, hadith came in the first century. And because there's a narration, Imam al-Zuhri rahimahullah, Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, the great hadith narrator, and also his contemporary or his scholar, Abu Bakr ibn Hazm. These two Imams were told by Umar ibn Abdul Aziz rahimahullah to write down the hadith. So the scholars say, look at the narrations. أول من دون الحديث, the first one to write down hadith, Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri. So this narration says that Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri is the first to do tadween al-hadith. What does that tell me? What does that tell us? The interpretation, many scholars and especially Orientals said tadween means record. Hence, no one recorded before him. What's wrong with this? We said there's a difference between tadween, tasnif, wal kitaba. And how do we know this? We're going to see in a second. The Sahaba wrote down books. So the word that was used caused the biggest confusion. Because the ulama never intended by those narrations that he's the first. Everyone knows objectively he's not the first. And how can he be when he comes in the first century and he's a whole generation ahead of him? We can also use the Arabic definitions of tadween and tasnif. If you go back to the Arabic dictionary, you can see that it's used to mean different things. Tadween is used more broadly for any recording of any type, whereas sometimes tasnif is used for a special collection which has chapters and classification. But in any case, even Shihab al-Zuhri is not the first to write hadith. So we cannot use such narrations. And we'll see in a second. Let's get to the actual narration. Imam al-Bukhari, he reports in his Sahih, Kitab al-Ilm, chapter, how the religious knowledge was taken away. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, rahimahullah, wrote to Abu Bakr ibn Hazm, an Imam Hadith, saying, look for the knowledge of Hadith and get it written. So I'm afraid that religious knowledge will vanish. And then he continued telling him to do that, and he did it. So this narration Bukhari brings to Kitab al-Ilm. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, rahimahullah, told who? Abu Bakr ibn Hazm, and also later Ibn Zuhri, to write the hadith down. These two Imams. So who are they? Zuhri, Imam al-Zuhri, and Abu Bakr ibn Hazm. Now some may say, that's clearly showing that the hadith was written down at this time. But the question we're asking, what was Umar Abdul Aziz asking them that was not already happening before him? What was happening before him was people writing down private collections. No one was doing what we call today like a mass, or like we can call it like standardization hadith collection. Example, time of Sahaba and the Quran. Abu Bakr is the first to write or compile the whole Quran in one mushaf, right? Sahih Abu Bakr. Then comes Uthman, he standardized it. Does that mean the Quran wasn't written down in the time of Rasulullah? No, we know the Sahaba have their own personal copies. Everyone had their own parchments or bones, whatever they used, and we talked about it. Hence, nafs al-shay. Same thing for the hadith. We have to understand this, and we're going to prove now examples of it. Because if you don't accept this, you're going to use this proof, and people do this, especially Orientalists, because they don't, and many of them did it on purpose, they did not do a thorough research. Some of them just did a quick research, they found this narration, and they rejected the rest. And some of the ulama, when they interpret this narration, they interpreted this way, that this was the first time hadith written, and it was a wrong interpretation. Let's just give an example. Hafid ibn Hajar, rahimahullah, died 852 Hijri, in Hadi al-Sari, or Hadi al-Sari, which is the Muqaddimah. Hadi al-Sari is Muqaddimah Sahih Bukhari. In there he says, that the knowledge of the narrations of the hadith, or the athar, the narrations of the hadith of Rasulullah were not written down at the time of the Sahaba, or the senior Sahaba, and those after them, due to two reasons. Number one, this was the time period, the beginning of revelation, so they were busy recording the Quran out of fear that the hadith will mix with the Quran. And number two, he says, due to them having great memories and quick understanding, so they didn't need to write it down, or the fear that writing down would weaken the memory. So here Ibn Hajar is clearly saying that they didn't write it down. And some of the ulama, they found this to be problematic, because Ibn Hajar, rahimahullah, he said it, but he didn't prove it. Later in the explanation of this narration, he says the same thing. So some of the ulama say, wait, we have to compare this statement of Ibn Hajar to the proofs. Is it true? And the answer is, it's not true. And Ibn Hajar never intended to deny early compilations. What he was probably trying to say was it was not widely written at the time of the Sahaba. What we call Tadween Am, the general overarching, or some of the ulama called it the Tadween or the recording Al-Rasmi, the official recording, versus a Tadween Al-Ifradi, individual recording. And the reason I'm going to differentiate between these two is because if you told me the Sahaba never wrote any book of hadith, the first reply to them is that there's a Sahabi amongst many who wrote the hadith, like Abdullah bin Amr al-As. Abdullah bin Amr al-As had his own sahifa, his own book. So how can we explain this? You see, if someone just said to you, this is a claim, I have a hadith now, and I have proof there's a Sahabi who wrote a book of hadith, and you said no one wrote it. So clearly either the ulama meant something else, or the Orientalists are doing this on purpose, and others who are taking their words. What's more correct is to interpret the ulama statement in light of general versus specific, or Sheikh Abdul al-Qaadir, Hafidhullah Ta'ala, he says in his comment of the same hadith in Bukhari, he says what this narration of Umar Abdul Aziz is telling us is that there's a public official recording, Tadween Rasmi, and there's something called Tadween Al-Ifradi, a general, a private, individual recording of hadith. So Umar Abdul Aziz, he was doing the first Tadween Rasmi, the official, standard, governmental. Just like Umar, Uthman and Abu Bakr did the standardization of the Quran. Everybody's with me in this? Tadween Rasmi means he told two imams to go and collect the hadith, put it together, and we're going to distribute. Versus everybody has his own mushaf, sahifa, or his own kurasa, small notebook at home. And Sheikh Abdul al-Qaadir, how did he get there? He said the proof for this is clear. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam told one Sahabi to write down a khutbah for another Sahabi. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam did a khutbah one day, and then Sahabi came up to say, Rasulullah, can you write it down for me? He said, Uktubud Abi Shah. Write it down for Abu Shah, that was his name. So they wrote down the summary of the khutbah, which gives us proof for making transcription for the khutbah, right? If you wonder why we record the khutbah and write, Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam did it. So because the Sahabi wanted to take back that knowledge. So he told them to write for him. That means it was private writing. Second proof, that Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam had Sahaba writing the hadith and he didn't tell them anything the whole life. He never told them, stop writing. So what did we learn from this? If the person who thinks the hadith was written after 120 Hijri, roughly, or you can say first century, it was the beginning, and usually they start with 120 Hijri. So they argue that a hadith was not written until 120 Hijri. We tell them that is false. And what's our reasoning? That number one, the narration of Umar Abdul Aziz and others was talking about governmental or official recording, not private. And number two, we're going to see that the Rasul had Sahaba write, and he did not reject their writing. Had it been wrong to write the hadith or was not happening, then there would be no proof for this. So this is how we understand this narration. So we cannot be taking narration and then just using it as sole evidence. And we know Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, we don't do that anyways. We have adillah, we always make jama'ah. You collect the evidences and try to understand them. Let's move now to prove something further. The companions, radiallahu ta'ala anhum, they did not do the public recording of hadith because Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't allow them yet. And how do we know this? We'll see in a second. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was telling the Sahaba to write down the hadith, and they were doing that in a public level. So the scholars explain that the Sahaba were busy with the Quran compilation. And when I say this, I mean not the entirety of it, but generally it was being started. And Abu Bakr, he completed the whole thing. I mean, he has one book for it all. But Rasulullah was having it compiled. And so Ibn Hajar, his point now goes back. We go back to it. Why would the Sahaba didn't write down the hadith publicly? Because number one, they're preoccupied with recording the hadith, Quran. They're writing the Quran. Number two, Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't want them to mix the Quran with the hadith, out of fear that it becomes mixed. And that's number two. And number three, there's some hadith that tell us don't write down the hadith initially. And they're going to see why. It goes back to these points. So the difference between the Quran and Sunnah now is that the Quran's compilation occurred in the time of Rasulullah, both memorization officially and recording officially. Time of Rasulullah, he told everyone to memorize as much as they can the Quran. He used to read it to them. So what you can say, there's a hifd rasmi, there's like a hifd program going on, time of Rasulullah. He finishes, he recites, and they memorize, right? And there's also official recording. He has scribes, Pay attention to this point, because we said last time, when you know this, there's no doubt someone can bring to you about the Quran. As for hadith, the hadith, we say that it was memorized officially by the Rasul ﷺ, telling the Sahaba to memorize it, and they used to, but recording privately. Is it clear? This is important. And the reason why is because Nabi ﷺ was worried about the mixing in the Quran, and also the fact, the priority of the Quran being finished first. Now we move to the next point. Who are the Sahaba who recorded the hadith? And how do we know that they did? So Mustafa al-Azami, rahimahullah, he mentions that the Sahaba, they used to record the hadith in different booklets or books. Sometimes they called a nuskha, a copy, or sahifa, a sheet. And it's called a sahifa, a difference between a mushaf and a sahifa. We don't call a mushaf Abu Bakr, we call it sahifa Abu Bakr. And a sahif, because its sheets are not the same size. One is longer, one is shorter. Whereas Uthman's like what we have today, standard. So sahifa is just a parchment. Somebody has a paper, he has a bunch of them put together. Risala, a letter. Kitab, a book, which can also refer to a letter. Kurasa, a notebook. All these words were used to refer to some writing material. So he says, for purposes of ease, to make it easy, you could think of all of these as a type of book. They're type of books. Some are big, some are small. Some have many hadith, some have one hadith to a few hadith. And you know the Sahaba had it because they used to refer to another to go check it. So one example, they came to Abdullah ibn Amr al-As, and asked him, which of the two cities is going to be conquered, Constantinople or another one? And he said, go open my chest, get out the book. And when he brought him the book, he read it to him, the hadith. So that means what they used to call it, we'll see, is a sahifa. His was called sahifa. So if you call it whatever you want to call it, it's the same thing. Another example, Rasulullah used to write letters to Sahaba and also letters to non-Muslims. In the letter has a hadith. He's telling them to do something. That's called a risala. It's a hadith. It's a hadith book for our purposes. So now Mustafa Azmi, he's the first one to prove, and that's why his research is groundbreaking. Even the Orientalists agreed. No one before him ever did this. And the time period he's writing, brothers and sisters, he's writing in 1980 something, I believe. No, more even before that actually, before the 80s. So I think somewhere in the 60s or 70s. There's no books that are published. Everything he's reading is manuscripts himself. So he went to the manuscripts of Islamic libraries to find out every single Sahabi, Tabi'i, an alim who wrote down a hadith book from the first, second, third generation. And look at the numbers. 50 Sahabi he found who wrote the hadith time of Rasulullah. 50. Now one, brothers, 50. And each one in his book, from page 200, it starts from page 28 to page 182. It's just one by one. Everybody's name, what he wrote, reference, name, what he wrote. I may Allah reward him, rahimahullah, rahmatu wasi'ah. Imagine the kind of juhud. Shaykh Al-Albani praised this guy, this imam, this shaykh, because of the efforts he brought for the hadith studies. And he's talking to the enemies of Islam. So he's finding, he's recording. And what he found is that 50 Sahaba. If you want some of the names, you can find. Right? In that book, for example, Abdullah ibn al-As. Right? We're going to find later there's Ali and others. So there's many. Ibn Mas'ud, he brings many. So if you want all the names, go there. He also has a book, just for a side benefit, on the scribes of Rasulullah. Separate book. All these books are in English too, translated. It's original Arabic. Some were English, turned to Arabic, Arabic to English, some of them like that. So then he found 49 tabi'un, 49. So these are first century. 49 of the tabi'un wrote down the hadith. So what does that mean? Sahaba of the first century, and then at the same century, the students of them, 49 of them. Then the late first and early second century, he found 87 scholars, 87. Who are these latter scholars? People like Az-Zuhri wa Abu Bakr ibn Hazm. The two we mentioned, that Umar ibn Aziz sent, what century are they coming? Late first, early second. So that's the 100 years we're talking about. So before them, 50 plus 49, almost like 99 different books have been written before Imam Zuhri wrote anything. Brothers and sisters, it's important for us to know, even if you know even one of these numbers. Someone who doesn't know anything about hadith, look at you shocked. Because they're being told by the Orientalists and Christians, they love this nonsense too. And they come and say, oh, your first book was written 150 Hijri. What book are they talking about? Sirah ibn Ishaq, Masakin, they know nothing about deen. Right? What are you talking about, right? They say, oh, that's the first one. And I'll show you some of them, how they use this against the lay people, because they know they don't know. So even Ishaq is early, but come on. Because now you're going to tell them, I have 99 books. So now they're going to run away if you tell them that. Another one now. After that, the last century he did was second century. 251 scholars of hadith have books. That's the one that many of us are familiar with, some of the biggest books, right, as we know. And in the earlier books, you also, some of them we know of, Musannafat and stuff like this. طيب, so he's proven now, without doubt, there's so many books, and all of them referenced. Now, once we understand this, so 50 Sahaba wrote books, 49 Tabi'un, 87 Atba'a Tabi'un, and then 251 ulama after that. But we're still missing something, which is, where are these books? Right, so let me come to you. So you say 99 books, right? Where are they? So we have to answer that question. Not for the Muslim, because the Muslim knows we already memorized this. Our ulama, and they've written and memorized it. And that's always the X factor that you have to bring to a conversation. Because the Orientalist believes, and non-Muslim, that you guys only have manuscripts which extend. Like they're preserved books. That's it. We tell them, no, that's a memorization aid. We memorize it, and then we write. We write to memorize. So we don't need the book to memorize it. Hence, the ulama who came after, like Imam Ahmed, for example, he memorized all these ahadith. And Bukhari, 600,000 ahadith, asanid, he knows them more. So all this he knows these. But if you look at his book, where are they? And this is we're going to see this claim later. Mustafa Azmi answers it. Simple discussion, but people say that you say Bukhari is the most authentic. It says in his biography he had more than 600,000 hadith. Why his book only has 7,000 something with repetition? And we're looking at them like, did he say he wrote all the hadith in his book? And what does it mean, different types of hadith? It means different asanid. One hadith, if it has 10 isnad, it's 10 hadith. You have to know that. 10 hadith means 10 hadith, always. Some of us, we don't know this. And this is why the hadith science is so important for Ahlul Sunnah Jama'ah and Salafiyun, Ahlul Hadith, wal Athar. So we have to know our tradition best, because someone may come to you and tell you some ridiculous thing like this. And Bukhari, why is he hiding the rest of his hadith? One thing like, what kind of nonsense is this? And we can also know Imam Ahmed, how much hadith in Muslim Imam Ahmed? How many? 27, some put 30, some put 40,000, depending on how you count it. How much hadith Imam Ahmed knows? They say 1 million. This is what they narrate him. Allahu A'lam. What is it? Million hadith. Some of us are scratching head. Million hadith. Where are those million hadith? Asanid, by athar. All of them. So different chains of transmission. So we'll get to that doubt later. Mustafa Azmi answers the question. He says, if the 120 year is the beginning of the official recording, what happened to the books earlier? He says in another book called Studies in Hadith Methodology and Literature, page 75, that if we say that these books were written, could it be said that either what I have described is totally wrong, or these books were in existence at some time but were lost? So that's one of our discussion. Could we say that they existed but were lost, or that the Shaykh got it wrong by the numbers? He says if we take the second hypothesis, that it was lost, it creates another problem, which is negligence of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ by the Muslim scholars. Are you telling me that ulama, they lost a hadith of Rasulullah ﷺ? And brothers, anyone who believes that, it's not Aqidah Sahihah. You're not allowed to believe that. We just said hadith preserved. So imagine someone told you today there's a hadith out there, maybe we don't know about it. No, there's no such thing, hadith we don't know about it. Every hadith we know exists, we know about it. In its asl, and if there's a ziyadat, that's different. That's important to know. But somebody cannot say there's a hadith somewhere out there, no one knows. Right? Because some of the ulama, one time I was reading, remember, Al-Albani, he did some ta'qeeb, some criticism of Imam Suyuti, who mentioned, rahimahullah, that we don't know about this hadith, but perhaps another hadith out there that we don't know about. And he said, no, we can't say this. Why? Because what does it mean? Hadith are lost. So it doesn't mean that. It means that the hadith are all there. The origins of an addition. Yes, every day we might find a new book, but it's always going to give us what we already know, but additional understandings of that. Now there's going to be something we never heard before. Because remember, go back to the idea of preservation. So what's his conclusion? He says, here's the answer. These books were not destroyed, nor did they perish, but they were absorbed into the works of latter scholars. When the encyclopedia-type books were produced, scholars did not feel the necessity to keep the early books. So slowly they disappeared. And to explain this point, he says, I will mention proofs. So let's give one example. Musnad Imam Ahmed, rahimahullah, when he wrote it, he took many of the earlier books and he put it into them. Because what's a musnad? What does it mean to be a musnad? It's organized by narrator. So he puts the narrator's name, he brings the hadith. So imagine there's a hadith book out there for Ali or even Mas'ud or any other Sahabi. Whatever hadith that came with those asanid, Imam Ahmed will learn them first. Of course, when he learned them, he put them in that book. So you don't need that one anymore if you have this one. And that's what happened. Over time, that book absorbed everything before it. And you can see the size of Imam Ahmed's book versus others. And that's why I'm going to now mention tangible proof to show that this Shaykh's theory is not far off. And that is the Sahifa of Hammam ibn Munabbih. This is the one we're going to talk about quickly today. The earliest known manuscript of hadith is a hadith book called the Sahifa of Hammam ibn Munabbih, who is Wahab Munabbih's brother. Hammam ibn Munabbih. So this Munabbih, yeah. So this narrator, he's a brother of Wahab ibn Munabbih, another Imam. His Sahifa is called the Sahifa as-Sadiqa, they call it, or Sahifa as-Sahiha, some they call it Sahifa as-Sahiha of Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu. Because Hammam is a student of Abu Hurairah. So what is his chain of transmission? Hammam to Abu Hurairah to Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You can't get higher than that, right? Literally, it's only one narrator. This book is one of the many that he mentioned, Dr. Azami, that existed. And it was found and published in 1979 by a contemporary scholar. And this scholar, he found the manuscripts in Damascus and in Berlin. Right? His name is Muhammad Hamidullah. He found the replicas of this book. I'm going to mention why it's replicas. It's not exactly this book. It's a copy of the book. Because before that, we thought this book was gone. So remember, we were claiming that this book came into Muslim Ahmed, right? So the argument was that, well, why don't we have any copies of that book? So our answer was because Imam Ahmed, when he compiled his book, he kind of just didn't need the book anymore. But here, this author, Muhammad, Dr. Muhammad Hamidullah, he found the manuscripts of a copy, so it's a replica, of 12th century copying of that book. Which means that this sheikh who wrote the book existed in his time period as one of the books that people read. As you know, brothers and sisters, some books we don't have them as they were, we have recordings of what they were. That doesn't mean the book is not authentic, this means that we have a copy, a trustworthy copy of it. But some of the early scholars have the actual copy. So what he's trying to argue here, that he found it in Berlin and he found it in Damascus, etc. He did tahqiq on it, then he translated himself. It's 231 pages and has a certain number of hadith, not that many. And this hadith book, since its copy is preserved, it gives weight to the fact that the ulama, what they claimed, that such a book even existed, and number two, was absorbed by earlier books, because the Sahiha, everything in it is in Musnad Ahmed. Go to the Musnad Abu Hurairah, you find all the hadith. And the muhaqqiqun, they just go there, just reference it too. And you can do it yourself. Check what he put there, the book's in PDF, Arabic, English, you go read it, you go to Musnad Ahmed, it's there. Imam Ahmed has his chain, Hammam has his chain. So the benefit is that it goes through Hammam ibn Munabbih to Abu Hurairah. So this proves that Muslims were not lying or making stories. Brothers and sisters, we don't really realize the Orientalists, the accusations they have of the ulama are so horrendous that they believe the ulama fabricated all the hadith. Some of them believe this. One of them, he said the whole Bukhari is fake. This is majnoon, right? Saqat, no loser, right? Who says this? The whole ummah agreed on this, nobody. And even the Orientalists, they fought each other. Some of the latter ones, we're going to quote them later, the heavyweights on their group who are with us. Because they know you can't be saying this stuff nowadays. But at that time, some of them, they have suspicion that the ulama fabricate, not hadith, entire books. And here we are saying that, look, our theory is this. Now we have a manuscript copy of it, and then we're making the claim. And if someone were to say, but you don't have the original, they say it doesn't matter. Our claim is already substantiated. But your claim that is written 120 downwards is based on what? A narration and no manuscript. So you're claiming something from a book of hadith. I claim something else in book of hadith. I have a manuscript to prove my point, and you don't have one. And it's very ironic that they use our books to make claims against our books. Just like the Quran. The Orientalists, one of them, he said it clear, any criticism against the Quran, the Orientalists brings from the books of the ulama. So you never get worried. Qira'at, this and that. What book are you reading? Suyuti? I read Suyuti too. So why you get wrong interpretations? Because you read Suyuti's work and you don't read the interpretation. They're not very honest. And this is why when you know this, you start to realize that what's really going on is that there seems to be insufficient education on their part, and it's changing. To prove more than this, let's finish the discussion with the hadith that supposedly prohibit writing hadith. And this is one of the strongest arguments that any hadith rejecter uses. It's a hadith in Muslim, Imam Muslim in his Sahih. Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiyallahu ta'ala anhu said that Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, "La taktubu anni," and do not write anything from me. And some versions say غير al-Quran. But now this version says لا تكتبوا عني, do not write from me. Means the hadith. وَمَنْ كَتَبَ عَنِّي غَيْرَ الْقُرْآنِ فَلْيَمْحُهُ, and then destroy it or erase it. So this part of the hadith, the Orientalist or the Quran doubter, hadith doubter, he loves this hadith. Forgetting that's a hadith, right? So he says, hadith is not recorded. I have a hadith. And we tell him, oh, mashallah, so where is that hadith? What's the isnad? And then he'll bring you the isnad. The same isnad he used it for the qiraat, right? Maskeen, right? So he says, so this hadith, how do we answer it? لا تكتبوا عني, do not write from me, is a hadith found in Muslims. So authenticity is there. Nobody can doubt. But we can question one thing. Is it marfu' or is it mawquf? So some of the riwayat, it mentions that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said it. So the first reply that the ulama hadith found, that Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim's teacher, he says the hadith is mawquf. It stops at Abu Sa'id Khudri. It's not marfu'. And again, those of us studied the Majlis, Arab hadith science, you remember those terms. Marfu' risen to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, mawquf stops at a sahabi. So Imam Bukhari is one of those who said the hadith is mawquf. This is a statement of who? Abu Sa'id Khudri. It's not a hadith. But even if you took it as a hadith, well, no problem. We have a response. But the first is to know that the dispute is not about its authenticity, it's about its level. Does it go higher or just stops there? But if we were to say the hadith sahih, no problem. Many of the ulama answered the hadith by saying that we know this cannot mean do not write hadith at all, because we just said that Rasulullah had Sahaba write down the hadith. How could it be that he says, don't write from me, and it was written from him? That means that Rasulullah was contradicting himself, or he was unaware, somebody was secretly recording it. It was not happening. So let's be honest, Rasulullah, no one's hiding a book and writing under it, no one's looking, but he's not looking. And the proof for this is the hadith of Abdullah bin Amr al-As himself. Abdullah bin Amr al-As, he said, I used to write down everything which I heard from Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, intending by it to memorize it. Hadith is Sunnah Abi Dawud Sahih. And that's the second nice benefit, that you used to write to memorize. Hence, you write to memorize. That's the goal, to write it to help you memorize it. So he said, I used to do it, but one day the Quraysh prohibited me by telling me, do you write everything that he says, alayhi salatu wasalam? And he's just a human being. He speaks when he's angry, when he's happy. So he said, I stopped writing when they told me this, because they put that doubt in him. How do you know what he says? Oh, it's a hadith. So what did he say? He said, when this happened, I went to Rasulullah to ask him. And this is how you deal with these doubts. You go back to the people knowledge that Rasulullah is going to explain to him. The Prophet put his finger to his mouth, said, Uktub, write. فَوَالَّذِي نَفْسِي بِيَدِهِ, the one who in his hand is my soul, مَا يَخْرُجُ مِنْهُ, nothing comes out of this, the mouth, إِلَّا حَقٌّ, except for truth. So he confirmed to him to keep writing. The benefit of the hadith, Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam knew he's writing, allowed him to write, told him to write. So don't come and tell me, لَا تَكْتِبُ عَنِّي, Uktub, write. That's one hadith. And if you want more, go to Kitab Taqiyud Ilm of Hafid Khalil Baghdadi. He brings you many. Qayyud Ilm bil Kitab, Hadith Anas. Write down, secure knowledge by writing it down. But this hadith, what are we going to do with this hadith? So this hadith like these, there's very many, right? There's so many like this. So he brings this Imam, Khalil Baghdadi, every single hadith that shows writing the hadith. Then he brings the prohibition. Then he does, again, he's the first one to figure this out, that we cannot say the prohibition was always there. Rather, it was temporary. Here's now the reasons. Number one, response, hadith is mawquf. Whose hadith? Abu Sa'id Khudri. The hadith about don't write is mawquf, not marfu'. That's the first jawab. You can give that answer. And who said that? Imam Bukhari. Second response, Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't mean that. And who said this? Hafiz ibn Hajar. He said it's not clear the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was prohibiting the hadith altogether. Because now Ibn Hajar, in the commentary of the hadith, Uktubu li Abi Shah, write the hadith or the khutbah down for Abu Shah. He says this hadith shows that clearly hadith was being written. Uktubu li Abi Shah, write it down for him. So he says, why did Prophet ﷺ permit Abu Shah to have a hadith collected and not the hadith of Abu Sa'id? He says we have to combine the hadith by saying that the Prophet ﷺ prohibited initially out of fear that the Quran will be mixed with the Sunnah. That's the second answer. So first answer, hadith mawquf. Second answer, that the fear was there that the Quran will be mixed with the Sunnah. But when that fear disappeared, أَذِنَ لَهُمْ, he let them write. Another way he says, we can argue, a third way. And النهي خاص بكتابة غير القرآن مع القرآن. That the prohibition is specific to writing the Quran in the same mushaf or same copy with the hadith. You have to have two different books or two different copies. See, that's the third answer. Fourth answer, that this narration, لا تكتب عني شيئا غير القرآن, is mansukh. It's abrogated. And this is why, because the hadith about writing of Abu Shah is way late, much later. And we know hadith sciences and also in fiqh, if you have a later hadith which you can actually demonstrate its history, you can abrogate earlier. Fourth response, he says, that Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was afraid that the Sahaba would rely upon writing instead of memorization. So he prohibited them initially, but when the memory was going well, he allowed them after that. A fifth response, he also argues, the Sahaba and many Tabi'un disliked writing hadith, even though there is no harm in it, only because they preferred to memorize, or the intent was to memorize through it. So some of them wrote, and when they about to die, they destroyed. You guys ever come across a story like this? For example, Sufyan al-Thawri, rahimahullah, he has a hadith book. Before he died, he told his best student, destroy it. Someone will say, how? Why? Where's the hadith? Why did he destroy it? Because he only used it for memorization. He was afraid that people were going to attribute to him things. Also, his ikhlas, he didn't want to become so well known, he wanted to be more unknown. But if someone were to say, we lost the hadith, no. His copy has his students have his copies. The other people have another copy, another sheikh has the same hadith. But why did he write it down? Hifz. When it's done, it's done. So the benefit, we take all these answers. So anytime someone will come with this hadith, we tell them you have to put it in the right context. Otherwise, the only response you're going to have is that Prophet Muhammad said, don't write it, and then he rewrote it, therefore there's a contradiction. And if you want to make a contradiction out of this, then you're the one who has to respond to it, because the Quran is still free of contradictions. Inshallah, we'll end with this much due to the time. Salah time. But next week, inshallah ta'ala, we're going to move from there to the next point about the hadith narrators. Right? Who are the big imams who narrated the hadith? Now that we've proven the hadith was written in the first century, and we know that some of their collections, who are the narrators of hadith, and how does the isnad system work? Because in order for us to be able to get to the doubts that are raised by Orientalists, we must understand the asanid. And this is important for everyone. Even if you studied before or didn't study it, you must understand a little bit how it works. The more you know, the better. And then we're also going to take a look at how we can use the isnad system to show the superiority of Islam over all other religions. Now, one of the proofs that Islam is true is the isnad. Because we're the only religion that has it. And then we're going to look at later. I mentioned before, but some of the Jewish people, they tried to bring an isnad for the Torah. Right? According to our standards, mawdu'. Right? Their standard. Everybody's unknown. So they tried, because they know, right? They know, right? If you don't have isnad. So some of them, he fabricated one author, he did a tahqiq on their book based on our sciences. It's very, very funny. But the point is, Christians, they don't have it. But also Muslims should know the isnad system has been causing confusion for the Orientalists. I will talk about how and why. Anyone have any quick questions, inshallah? We'll take it. Yes. About the Abu Sa'id Khudri, yes. The Hadith Abu Shah. So, Uktubul Abu Shah. So what happened was, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he was giving khutbah, and Ahl Yemen came. And we know Ahl Yemen came later to Islam. So when they came, he listened, Abu Shah, for the khutbah, and then he said, Rasulullah, write it down for me. It's also in Muslim. So they said, this hadith abrogate that one, because we know the Ahl Yemen and the Wufud, the assemblies came later. With Abu Sa'id Khudri's hadith, it's an earlier hadith, and some say that even if you argue that it's latter, because some hadith said he, at the end of his life, the one in Bukhari Muslim, that he wanted to write it at his deathbed. And you have to remember that one. So what happened? Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam told him, come, I'm going to write you something. And then they argued, and then he didn't write. So scholars say, what was he trying to write? One interpretation, hadith. That's one interpretation. He was actually going to write them the hadith for them. SubhanAllah, to dictate the hadith. Another interpretation, he wanted to write them a wasiyah, that Abu Bakr will be the Khalifa, and things like this. But at the end of the day, if you argue it's not mansukh, some people may argue that we have other answers, alhamdulillah. So it's a comprehensive answer, yes. So that's a good point. That if we said there's no hadith missing, so was it possible early scholars did not know of a hadith that was missing? So the scholars, they say what it means, that some of the hadith we have today, we know they're like, for example, Shaykh Al-Albani rahimahullah, he authenticated many hadith. Some are, you could say, like if you look at the Sahih alone, 13,000, something like this hadith. Another scholar also agreed. So that, if you look at that in Bukhari Muslim, clearly there's additional hadith. But the scholars say those are ziyadat, that the asl is in Bukhari Muslim, but the additional wording. It's not like it's not something new we didn't know. But some of the early scholars, the reason why some of them said it, that they fear that there might be something he doesn't know. But what he should have said that, I don't know, instead of saying the hadith is lost. Because it would imply that some revelation was missing, which the ummah needs. And to also explain to us, the hadith, the scholars are divided into two ways. The asl, the original hadith, which all like hadith go back to, which is something around 4,000 something. And we'll talk about later. Then the additional hadith, which branch from that. So an example would be, if you find the hadith Tabarani, it's not like he has something that is totally not found in the 6 books of hadith. Somewhere there. So some of the scholars say that if you take the origin and take the ziyada, you're always going to find. But the thing about some of the scholars, perhaps you're right, that they might not have had access to all the hadith, or they made the claim fearing that they themselves didn't know. It was better to say it's hidden to me, or I'm not knowledgeable about that. Because if we claim that the hadith is missing, going back to the first point, it's preserved. And that will be open the door that there's a hadith that Allah wanted us to know about and practice, is Allah subhanAllah allowed us to forget, subhanAllah, which is unacceptable. And we're going to see later that the hadith numbers, and maybe I will do that maybe next week, how many hadith are there, where are they, which books, so someone can have a list. Because it's one of the most important questions. How many authentic hadith are there? How many weak? Inshallah, maybe next week we'll do that one. Any other question we'll take after salah, because I don't want to delay more. Subhanak bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha